Palestinian Authority only. Israel introduces a new visa stamp limiting entrance of foreign nationals to Palestinian Authority-controlled areas. A security necessity, or is Israel preempting a final settlement with the Palestinians, drawing the lines of a future Palestinian state and imposing the status quo? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Imran Garda. Israeli immigration has a new stamp for its visitors. It says Palestinian Authority only. With this new stamp comes a new restriction on the visitors' freedom of movement. It bars foreigners who say they are visiting areas under the Palestinian Authority from entering Israel. Israel claims this new border policy has been enforced for security purposes. Now, while this measure could cause a little inconvenience to tourists, Shireen Tadros reports on its far-reaching implications.
When Palestinian businessmen Mohammed and Khalid Sabawi moved to Canada 17 years ago and received citizenship there, they thought they'd escaped Israel's discriminatory policies. But new, tighter visa restrictions are now being imposed on anyone visiting the country with links to the Palestinian territories, even those with foreign passports. Last month, for the first time, Mohammed was denied entry at Tel Aviv airport. Eventually, he and his son were allowed in from Jordan via the bridge crossing. Israeli border officials gave them the normal 3-month tourist visa, but with a Palestinian Authority-only stamp on it. The stamp means they're confined to areas controlled by the Palestinian Authority. Much of their projects are outside these areas, so they're being forced to move their business abroad.
I'm not being treated as a Canadian citizen upon my entry. I'm being racially discriminated against because, one, I'm of Palestinian origin, two, because I have ties to the West Bank. I'm working in the occupied Palestinian territories. And they're discriminating against me. They're not respecting my Canadian passport. Another Canadian that had, let's say, ties only to Israel, that had a Jewish name, would be treated completely differently.
Other foreign nationals with links to the territories have had similar experiences in the past few months. They've gathered here to try and find a solution to the measure, which is illegal under the Oslo Accords. Betty is American. She came to visit her in-laws in the West Bank after her Palestinian husband died. At the Jordanian bridge crossing, she got the PA-only stamp.
Then I read that they're doing this for security, save themselves from terrorists. I'm 70 years old and a grandmother. I'm hardly a terrorist or any danger whatsoever to Israel.
In fact, Betty and anyone else with a PA-only stamp would only be able to enter these scattered areas in the occupied West Bank, which the PA has full or joint control over. The remaining 60% of the territory, including Jerusalem, is under full Israeli control and so off-limits to anyone given the new stamp. Observers say the Palestinian Authority-only stamp is just the latest effort by Israel to determine the status of occupied territory before a final settlement can be reached. Essentially, it's Israel defining and enforcing the borders it wants. For Palestinians already living under the Israeli military's permit regime, the inability to move around their own territory has always been a frustrating and humiliating part of this occupation. Now, foreign passport holders too are getting a taste.
Israel is now seeking acceptance from the international community of its policy to settle in the occupied territories illegally, of its policy to build the wall and de facto annex land beyond the wall, and of its annexation of occupied East Jerusalem.
Israeli officials turned down Al Jazeera's repeated requests for an interview. In a letter to the Prime Minister, the tourism minister argued the new measure significantly damages Israel's image and tourist industry. Meanwhile, the US consulate in Jerusalem describes the stamp as, quote, unacceptable because it treats people unequally. But if the new US administration is serious about stopping Israel's illegal activities, it will need to tackle this latest one head on. Shireen Tadros for Inside Story in the occupied West Bank.
Now, it's been suggested that the identifying of visitors to Palestinian Authority areas could be a subtle way of preparing for a future when there are two neighboring states, Israel and Palestine. Well, some have even suggested that the Israelis are putting in place measures that will continue to be enforced if and when a Palestinian state is founded. These include Israel's security fence, otherwise known as the separation wall, that cuts deep into Palestinian territory. It stretches from Beit Shean in the north to Arad in the south. When it's finished, it'll be over 700 kilometers long. It makes sure Jerusalem is firmly set on the Israeli side of the barrier. There are also the Israeli settlements. The rest of the world considers Israel's occupation of the West Bank illegal. Settlements there have been increasing since 1967. They now cover a large proportion of land that, including their bypass roads, fragment the West Bank. To access either side of the barrier or to move between PA and Israeli areas, there are over 600 checkpoints. Every person who crosses one has their ID inspected, thus keeping all movement under observation and often preventing movements altogether. Well, joining us today are our guests in Ramallah, Ghassan Khatib, political analyst and director of the Government Media Center. In Jerusalem, Hilal Frisch, senior research fellow at the Begin Sadat Center for Strategic Studies. And in Washington, D.C., Jeffrey Aronson, executive director of the Washington-based Foundation for Middle East Peace. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. Mr. Frisch, if I could start off with you, why is Israel issuing these stamps?
It's not quite clear, but I would say that this is a boon to Palestinians who seek statehood. And these kind of restrictions are very bad news for right-wing Israelis and many other Israelis who consider Judea and Samaria to be part of the historical homeland of the people of Israel, and who do not like demarcating those lands and exercising different laws in them than which exist in Israel proper.
Well, you're saying this is a good thing for the Palestinians. How so?
Yes, this is a boon to Palestinian people who support Palestinian statehood, because it's a sign on the part of the Israelis that the Palestinian Authority is different in an intrinsic way from Israel. Now, it's true that it might make it more difficult for certain people, but usually the creation of states involves tremendous hardship, and it curtails movement. For instance, under British and French imperialism in the Middle East, it was much easier to move both goods and peoples than it was when Arabs began attaining statehood.
But why wasn't it left to the PA to decide on permits such as these? Because critics will say this is just effectively Bantustans, like the types we saw in South Africa during apartheid.
Well, the limitations are concern movement into Israel or from Israel into the PA. It's customary for every sovereign state to limit movement from one state to other states, and this is a practice that is universal, and usually states do not give any kind of explanations for why they refuse people entrance into a specific state.
Ghassan Khatib, this is a boon to, sorry to interrupt you, Mr. Frisch, this is a boon to Palestinian statehood, says Mr. Frisch.
Well, what I heard is more or less looks like a joke, because we're not moving towards statehood and ending the occupation. In fact, under this particular Israeli government, we're moving in all aspects towards further consolidation of the Israeli occupation and further away from the possibilities of an independent state. First of all, Israel is the country that is controlling and occupying illegally the Palestinian territories. These are not two neighboring countries that will regulate the movement of people and commodities between them in accordance to the sovereign rights of any of the two states. This is one state occupying the other, controlling the movement in and out. Those people that we're talking about, whom are denied or allowed the entry, are denied or guaranteed that by Israel, not by the Palestinian Authority, although they are coming to the Palestinian territories and might like to go to the Israeli territories. Israel cannot be selective, cannot deal with us as if we are a state and prevent people from moving between our territories and Israel. And in other instances, they treat us as occupied people living under the control of Israel. If Israel decides to end the occupation, then we will live with any consequences of that. But they cannot continue occupying us, taking our land, expanding their settlements inside our territories, filling our territories with checkpoints that are not restricting the movement between Palestinian territories and Israel, but rather between the different populated areas of the Palestinian territories, and then call this as a sign of moving towards statehood.
Let's bring in Jeffrey Aronson. Mr. Aronson, which of the two gentlemen's arguments are you closer to?
Well, let me say this. From an American perspective, Israel seems to be discriminating against certain Americans based on whatever criteria they choose. This is and should be unacceptable to the U.S. government. And since actions regarding the entry of nationals is governed by the principle of reciprocity, ultimately, I would expect and hope that either Israel will rescind this decision, which a number of people in Israel obviously think is counterproductive, and even the defender you have on was hard put to put lipstick on this pig, so to speak. Or the U.S. will have to take action, I assume, against Israeli nationals seeking to enter the United States. This is, in fact, the way in which these issues have been dealt with in the past. There have been problems historically at a time when African Americans seeking to enter Israel were subject to burdensome regulations and inspections, and that was resolved, and I would fully expect Israel to adopt principles of non-discriminatory entry to U.S. nationals seeking to enter Israel and those territories that are internationally recognized still as under Israeli de facto control.
Let's remind ourselves now of the big picture. The Oslo Agreement divided the West Bank into 3 areas of control, pending a final status agreement on all outstanding issues, including Jerusalem. Area A is a tiny area of the West Bank. The Palestinian Authority has total control over both security-related and civil administration issues here. Area B is where the PA has civilian control over rural areas, but Israel controls security. Area C, this is more than half of the West Bank area, including Israeli settlements, the Jordan Valley region, and roads between Palestinian communities. All of these are under exclusive Israeli control. Our guests are still with us. Let's go back to Jerusalem and Hillel Frisch. Mr. Frisch, you can understand why many would see this as a unilateral enforcement of the borders by Israel before any final status agreement, either with the Palestinians or with the international community.
Wow, that's really far-fetched. I mean, this is an administrative move that could have really serious implications on the borders of a future Palestinian state is really far-fetched. But
well, you just said it was a boon to Palestinian statehood, and now you're saying it's not much.
To Mr. Aronson, every third world national, every foreign national knows that the United States discriminates against citizens of every other country in the world. And it's daily practice that the United States sometimes allows, for instance, British nationals entry and sometimes refuses them. Every state in the world discriminates against nationals of other states for loads of reasons, and they never give the reason for why they discriminate. This is acceptable international.
They don't ever discriminate on the basis of ethnic identity, however.
Oh, I wouldn't know, because the United States doesn't explain why they deny entrance to people. So
yeah, but Mr. Frisch, aren't we talking about apples and oranges here? Mr. Frisch, aren't we talking about apples and oranges here? Because the United States is not occupying its neighbor for 41 years. These are completely different issues, aren't they?
Well, but you know that there are many in Israel and there are many in the world who claim that this is no occupation, that there was no sovereignty in Judea and Samaria and Gaza to begin with. When Jordan took over, it was a unilateral move, and only 2 states at that time, Pakistan and Britain, acknowledged it. So, and there was never a Palestinian state to begin with. So I'm not sure that we're talking about occupation after all.
Okay,
let's get back to the
okay, make your point. If you can make your point in 30 seconds, sir, then we can go to Ghassan Khatib after that.
Yes, I just don't see really the relationship between this micro move and this macro outcome of dictating what the Palestinian state is going to be. I mean, if the Israelis really think that this is going to influence what those future borders are, they're just being very silly and wrong.
Ghassan Khatib, no relationship between the micro move and the macro outcome, says our guest in Jerusalem.
I think there is a relation, but first let me set the record straight concerning occupation or non-occupation, and let me say that the United Nations officially refers to the Palestinian territories as being occupied, as being under belligerent military illegal occupation. This is the official line and position of the United Nations, and this is the position of every single country in the world, with the exception of Israel, and including the policy of the United States. So there is no debate over whether this is occupied or not. This is something that is of consensus worldwide, with the exception of Israel. Now, I think that this move, this Israeli move, like many other Israeli moves, has 2 levels of dimensions. First is immediate, and in this regard, I should say that this measure harms the Palestinian side, because we're talking here about, for example, experts who might be coming to do work in the Palestinian territories and needs to move inside the Palestinian occupied territories, not necessarily to Israel, but even inside the Palestinian occupied territory, different areas in which the movement is restricted by the Israelis. But in addition to the immediate negative effect, there is also the linkage of such measures with the final and ultimate Israeli objectives. Israel is trying to redraw the borders between Israel and the Palestinian territories in a way that violates the international law and the borders of 1967. So they try by this to add to the facts created unilaterally, illegally by them, in order to prejudge the future solution that should be based on the 2 states on the borders of 1967.
I want to bring in Jeffrey Aronson now in Washington, D.C. regarding U.S. pressure on Israel. As you mentioned, the U.S. consulate said that this move by Israel was unacceptable. We're hearing that U.S. Envoy George Mitchell is meeting Israeli officials later on in the week. Do you think he needs to bring this visa stamp issue up, including other issues like settlement expansion?
Well, look, it's certainly unfortunate that the U.S.-Israeli agenda, which is meant to focus on broad issues of constructing a successful diplomatic framework for ending the occupation and creating a Palestinian state, is now confronted with what seems to be an Israeli violation of bilateral understandings with the U.S. on treatment of entry of the other nationals into the state of Israel. This is putting, if you will, one more goat in the room that has to be addressed before we can begin perhaps once again to focus on the broader issues. And in that sense, it's very unfortunate, certainly from the U.S. perspective. Perhaps there are those in Israel and elsewhere who prefer to stuff the room full of goats so that we don't ever get to a point where we're making the hard choices about the future. Having said that, I would think that the U.S. would and should move quickly and forcefully in whatever avenues are acceptable in these cases to reaffirm the obligations that Israel has made in its understandings in the past with the United States. Because after all, what we're talking about here is not restricting access to the occupied territories, although access to Gaza has been in place for quite some time. But what we're talking about is U.S. nationals being prohibited from traveling in or through or working in the state of Israel itself. And that seems to be, on the face of it, a violation of bilateral understandings that exist between Israel and the U.S.
Hillel Frisch, you're adding another goat to the room.
About talking about goats, one should realize that there's an elephant. The elephant is, of course, complete Palestinian disunity and the division into two statelets, one in Judea and Samaria and the other in Gaza. And that is really the elephant that prevents any true significant movement towards peace. So that the goats play a very, very small role. And I don't think that a real peace process
Mr.
can
Frisch,
ever take place.
very briefly, do you believe that settlements should stop
achieved
in the West Bank, the area you refer to as Judea and Samaria?
Whether I feel that settlements, I think that this is part of the historical homeland of the Jewish people, and Jews have a right to live on every inch of Eretz Israel, the land of Israel. And
so UN Security Council resolutions, international law, none of that means anything to you?
I don't know whether I could think of Security Council resolutions that specifically outlaw settlement by Jews in Judea and Samaria.
All right, gentlemen, we have reached the end of our discussion. Thank you very much for joining us. Ghassan Khatib in Ramallah, Hillel Frisch in Jerusalem, and Jeffrey Aronson in Washington, D.C. And thank you so much, the viewer, for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. As always, we welcome your comments and suggestions. Email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Bye-bye.